I wanted to talk with you about an article that combines Putin, Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher, and the theme of the decline of the West. I think what we should talk about in relation to this article is the business of what it's like to communicate as a public intellectual. On the main channel and on the chat channel, I recently shared little square with criteria for distinguishing a propagandist from a public intellectual. But in fact, all of these criteria, or most of them, were really criteria for being a responsible intellectual, not a public intellectual, but just an intellectual. And that's, I think, important because you want to make sure that your public intellectual is responsible as an intellectual before they go around and about doing their public things. And what I didn't mention in that little printout square is that there is also an ethic of being a public intellectual. It's quite different. And we're going to not analyze it in this little chat, but we're going to touch upon it for the first time. It's a different thing, and it's a more seductive and more manipulative thing, being a public intellectual. You are always focusing on what you're going to emit. You're also always focusing on not the ideas themselves, but on your audience, how to inspire them, to motivate them, to liberate them out of something they're stuck in, and so on. If they aren't moving, you have failed. It doesn't matter how smart what you've said is. You see? So there's quite a different ethic. And while I do use the word seduction and manipulation, you can do this seduction and manipulation in a deeply responsible way with integrity, or you can do it in a self-serving way, and you can do it in a destructive and dark way. And why ethics and integrity are so important to being a public intellectual is that very often the audience won't know. You know, some of them will know inherently whether you can be trusted or not, but in the end they won't know. And so you end up with thousands and hundreds of thousands of people following charlatans, sometimes sort of conscious charlatans, sometimes sort of semi-charlatans, de facto charlatans who aren't themselves cognizant of the fact that they're charlatans. And the audience often cannot know. Some of the audience will, but most of the audience won't. So this is something that you really got to take seriously. You got to put public intellectuals up against a kind of ethical wall. And if they look dodgy, we've got to talk about it and make them answer our questions about what seems like their dodginess. So that's what we're going to do a little bit of. I'm going to touch on a little bit in this chat. And it's a chat about a little piece that John Gray, the British public intellectual and philosopher, wrote in the New Statesman, which is a UK-based publication. And it is in connection with the reissuing of two books about Nietzsche by Pushkin Press. One is Leslie Chamberlain's Nietzsche in Turin from the mid-90s, and the other is Guy Deportal's book on Nietzsche from the late 1920s. And the majority of Gray's piece is about Nietzsche's habits and Nietzsche's rituals and Nietzsche's coping with his illness. And as a way of warming us up, I wanted to share with you a little aside about how we must think about talking about the health and the mental health of people in the historical past who have made brilliant contributions in the arts or in the world of ideas. I'll just give you a little footnote about that, and then we'll get to the public intellectual business. What's interesting from the public intellectual point of view in this piece is that Gray gives you a center of gravity for his piece, for his essay, that is just one sentence long, and that is it. And he does it because he doesn't want to test the appetite of the reader, and he also feels that doing it will send the reader off with that one sentence sort of percolating inside their heads a bit, whereas if you made it 12 or 27 sentences, the reader might conscientiously sort of work their way through all of this, but it won't stay with them in the same way. So the brief approach here opens the reader up. The elaborate, lengthy approach would shut the reader down. So let's first of all say a little bit about the 3 or 4 pages of the essay that go before the center of gravity sentence, and largely discuss Nietzsche's rituals and habits. And I want to make a side point here about health and mental health in historical figures. Here is Gray. Nietzsche had cultivated the habits of an invalid for many years. Migraines, myopia, insomnia, nervous exhaustion pursued him from his 20s. He sought out ambiences where the light was mellow, the breeze gentle, and the people cheerful. And here Gray quotes from Leslie Chamberlain's Nietzsche in Turin. This sort of list of Nietzsche's guidelines about habituation when ill, when you're a genius and you're ill. Wait for tea to cool before drinking it, avoid all alcohol and avoid crowds, reading, writing letters, wear warm clothes in the evening, eat rhubarb from time to time, have a napkin at breakfast, remember your notebook. And Gray goes on for several pages with this sort of stuff very beautifully until he lands where he lands with this key sentence at the end. But let's first of all talk about this ritualistic habitual stuff from the point of view of health and mental health. I want to make a point about health and a point about mental health. Don't mistake all of these lines about how Nietzsche perfected the habits of an invalid for the thought that Nietzsche wasn't really ill. He was. He had a serious health condition. Gray talks about syphilis. I suspect Nietzsche may have had codicil, which is a very serious condition that affects your small blood vessels. I suspect that's what Nietzsche may well have had, and that's what Nietzsche's dad, who died very young, may well have had. But whatever Nietzsche had, we're talking about a serious condition with very serious theological consequences. This wasn't just some kind of spectacularly rare genius going potty. No, this is real illness. And Nietzsche says in his diaries, God damn it, I'm my own doctor. He wasn't getting medical help he needed. And even today, while Nietzsche probably would have got the medical help we needed, we know that there are chronic health conditions that aren't getting the research and the understanding that they need, even in our world today. So what does this mean? It means when we think about Nietzsche, let's not mess around too much and start with a robust realization the guy is really ill. Like the guy would have needed a team of neurologists to supervise his life and medicate him and test him. So let's not romanticize this. Number one. Number two, mental health. Madness and genius are mutually exclusive. Sorry. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't be mad and a genius. What it does mean is that insofar as you are a genius, to that degree, you're not mad. There is a kind of a myth in our culture of loopiness and pottiness going together with immense creative talent in the arts and in the intellectual professions. And that's a load of baloney. And moreover, this is associated in our culture typically with Freud. And one of the classic statements against this sort of romantic connection of creativity and poor mental health is Freud himself, as ever our cartoonish pictures of Freud don't bear out in reality. And there's a line that I don't remember verbatim now from one of the psychoanalytic meetings in Vienna in 1908, something like that, where Freud says, whenever we're in the realm of great human accomplishment, neurosis retreats into the background. That's to say, yes, Beethoven may have been mad and may have had many aspects of his life in disarray, but insofar as his music production went, his compositional production went, to that extent he wasn't mad at all. So let's get rid of this myth, and especially let's get rid of the association of this myth with Freud. So having put this aside on the table, let's try to move to the intellectual centerpiece of Gray's essay as an exercise in the virtues of being a public intellectual. So I'm going to read a few sentences, and one of them is going to be the key sentence. This is toward the very end of Gray's piece. The most prophetic of the 19th century thinkers, Nietzsche discerned that the seemingly triumphal march of European progress was heading for a cataclysmic fall. He feared an era of great wars, which as he drifted into madness, he imagined he could prevent. His breakdown may have come with the realization that, like his illness, the malady he diagnosed was fated to run its course. Here is the sentence. Nietzsche believed that without a spiritual realm in which goodness and truth are one and the same, as Plato affirmed in his timeless forms and Christianity in the divine logos, that values are ultimately expressions of human will. So let's read this sentence without the filler now about Plato and Christianity. Nietzsche believed that without a spiritual realm in which goodness and truth are one and the same, values are ultimately expressions of human will. Let's read on for another sentence or two and then come back. Gray goes on, rationality in that case is simply a tool which can be used for the sake of chaos and barbarism as much as order and civilization. At present, Vladimir Putin prosecutes a war of terror with calculated savagery. And this is a case of reason serving Dionysian forces of the darkest kind. And the mention of the Dionysian forces, of course, is a reference back to Gray's early explanation of Nietzsche's distinction between the Apollonian and the Dionysian, that is customary distinction to emphasize in such short pieces. And here's what Gray says about that at the very beginning of his essay. In his seminal work, The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music, this is a work by Nietzsche with which you must never, ever, ever, ever start reading Nietzsche. In his seminal work, The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche defined the Apollonian virtues of reason and order, which emerged in opposition to the Dionysian forces of ecstatic vitality. In Greek mythology, Apollo was the god of music and the sun, Dionysus of wine and dance. In Nietzsche's view, both Apollonian harmony and Dionysian energy were necessary in a balanced culture. And that's just by way of background to Gray's point about how reason, in the case of Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine, is for Gray serving Dionysian forces of the darkest kind. So now we've centered ourselves with how Gray ends this piece. Let's come back to this sentence and simplify it even further. Without a spiritual realm in which goodness and truth are one and the same, values are ultimately expressions of the human will. Well, let's just simplify this even more. Gray's basically giving the reader the thought, without elaborating on it much, that there is a good way of living a human life, but in this case a good way of living a human life on a collective and political level, and then there is truthfulness, and that the two may get in each other's way and not be harmonious, not just in the sense that truth doesn't lead to goodness, but in the sense that it's actually incompatible with it. And Gray's just giving you this and pushing you out, and you can sort of float around the lake, around the sea with that thought, and I'm not going to give you any more, Gray says. Well, let's add a few sentences onto this thing with which Gray wants to depart us off the bank, but in Gray's spirit, keep ourselves sufficiently stimulating but evasive at the same time. constructively evasive. Well, one very Nietzschean thought that's a kind of elaboration to what Gray is giving us there is the thought that liberal democratic institutions, by which I don't mean anything ideological, I just mean the modern democratic republic, which is roughly going to be inclusive of all Western countries today, although the brackets of that will be slightly wider. But that kind of way of running your society is something we like. We want more of it. In fact, when we eviscerate our own societies for falling short, we typically just say, well, that's the sort of thing we just want more of. That's the sort of thing we just want done better. We don't want to get rid of this. We don't want to go to an authoritarian way of organizing our society. So we want more of this. And Nietzsche is saying, well, look, it's possible that your justifications, the stories you tell yourselves about how these institutions and social practices have come about and how they're justified, that these stories are not only false, but no longer believable by you yourself. And you end up in a kind of situation where you want, for practical and ethical reasons, these social practices and these institutions to persist, but the stories you tell yourself about them, about why they are good and legitimate and justified and appropriate, aren't any longer believable to you. So what do? You either give up on these stories and then give up on these social practices and institutions, or you give up on these stories but try to put together different stories and different justifications for the institutions which you want to persist. Can you do that? Well, Nietzsche wants to send you out with that task, saying, I don't know, maybe they will be able to, maybe they won't. I've been dead for a long time, so I'm patient, and I'm going to lay there and wait and see. So that's one kind of incompatibility between truthfulness and organizing your society in a way that you consider to be a good way. And in our conversations on the main channel, on the chat channel too, we have named repeatedly one example that's relevant here, and that's the example of teleology. That's the example of thinking of the political development of societies in a kind of a theory of stages, thinking of ourselves as moving towards a species-wide civilization that might sort of culminate on a convergence around a particular kind of model of democratic capitalism. We often mentioned Francis Fukuyama's book and article from the late 80s, early 90s in this connection. And so Nietzsche's here going to say, well, look, it might be that you are connecting your justification of the modern democratic republic with these stories of progress. But once you give up on these stories of progress, and you've already given up on them, in Nietzsche's view, you're just not admitting that, then you won't be able to justify these institutions that you want, these social practices that you want. So that's just one example of the stories we tell ourselves about the institutions we have that may lead us into a scenario where we want the institutions but can no longer believe the stories. This is really the conversation that should be continued. This is the conversation where a great deal of depth resides, but we're going to just push it out off the bank and let it go. And just mention one more potential incompatibility that's separate but related about the relation of truthfulness and liberal democracy. And that's that opacity and deception may be the norm when it comes to running complex societies. And you can only get away with running complex societies without a great deal of opacity and deception under special and lucky and privileged historical circumstances. And when these circumstances pass, you're going to be in trouble. And your liberal democracies ain't going to persist. Is this true? Is this not true? Well, Nietzsche would say, you're going to have to find out. And insofar as you can, as it were, make it true, you had better do that. So that's another way in which there may be a tension implied here in Gray's little sentence between truthfulness and us having the kinds of institutions that we want.